All right, here we go. It's really happening, live and in person. The 2023 Honor of Maryland Conference. Please give ourselves a round of applause. Huzzah! Good morning, everyone, and just welcome, welcome, welcome to all of you to our 2023 conference, Turning the Kaleidoscope, Magnifying Diversity, Demanding Equity, and Illuminating Inclusion. So it brings me great joy to welcome to the stage an expert guide on how our movement can collectively commit to an anti-racist framework and mobilize through an intersectional lens. Our first keynote speaker, Chacku Mathai, is a nationally recognized trainer and consultant who started in the consumer survivor ex-patient movement when he was 15 years old. He and his experiences with racism and xenophobia-related assault and trauma resulted in his own loss of safety and confusing extreme states as a youth and young adult. And experiencing continued racism in schools with police and the behavioral health system fueled a 35-year-long journey toward dismantling oppression, advocating for peer-driven alternatives, and transforming behavioral health systems. He's received numerous awards for his work and his advocacy, most recently as the 2020 Advocate of the Year by the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law. And you can read more about him on our conference website, but with no further ado, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Chacku Mathai.
All right, welcome. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me with you. I got to get a couple of things, my notes and my reading glasses. I'm not 15 anymore. So it's a great honor to be here. I'm looking around the room, and one of the things that I immediately think of is that I'm not a front of the room guy. I'm more of the guy in the back of the room, wondering how did that guy get in the front of the room, and held a lot of what he had to say in suspect, So I encourage you to do that, actually, The whole idea behind what we've done here today and all over the last 30 years, I want to just congratulate on our own Maryland, Katie and Mike and all, Jennifer and all of you who are working together in this community all across Maryland. It's a historic community. To be part of a conference, to be here today with you is an honor, a great honor. So when Jennifer first asked me, I without hesitation, just wanted to make every possibility, make that possible. I'm a father today of a 15-year-old starting high school this year, things like that. So I want to be home for her as much as possible. But, these are the kinds of things that getting to be a part of your community and to be with you during this time means a lot. So thank you, thank you, thank you. So there's a few things. It's tough, in a small amount of time. There's a lot to get into. So I'm probably not going to talk too much about myself, but you'll certainly hear about me in the middle of this, process. I do want to get to a couple important things before we begin. Get past some of those points. One is a land acknowledgement that is important for me to share with you, that we are each likely participating on the ceded and unceded land of Indigenous people. So for me, where I work, it's the Lenape homeland. The Lenape is here, yeah. And where I live in Rochester, New York now, is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, and honoring the sovereignty of the Six Nations, Mohawk, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Seneca, and Tuscarora. So I ask you to join me in acknowledging all Indigenous people of, I'm sorry, this says Minnesota. I should say Maryland. I was just in Minnesota. My apologies. And all of the ancestral and unceded lands of their people, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. And most of the institutions for which we work must also acknowledge that they were founded upon exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous people. And so this acknowledgement is just a small way in starting our process and demonstrating a commitment to begin the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. I also offer a labor acknowledgement, and that is that we must acknowledge that much of what we know of this country today including its culture, economic growth, and development throughout the history and across time, has been made possible by the labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants who suffered the honor of transatlantic trafficking of their people, chattel slavery, and Jim Crow. We are indebted to their labor and their sacrifice, and we must acknowledge the tremors of violence throughout the generations and the resulting impact that can be felt and witnessed today. I'm not sure we all feel the tremors the same way, but I know we feel them. It's in our bodies, all of us. How we heal from that, the racialized trauma that we carry has to be addressed and engaged. And that's part of why I brought up this keynote to be about deepening, and really being about, so glad we've started the conversation. We definitely need to be about engaging the conversation, right, in an interracial way. We need to be talking about keeping it on the table, sustaining the conversation. So I'm glad it's not stopped since 2020, for example, right? However, we also now need to take a deeper look. Why are things still the same in some respects, right? And so what does it take to really take that to a next level? So good news is I'm not going to share any more slides for now. All right? We're gonna talk. I have slides for visual aids and things like that most of the time because I might forget something, so I might turn to them. But what I really want to do is get to our conversation. And so for me, how I showed up as a young person in this movement, and I want to say, when I say, I came in young, I was literally raised by this movement. And first, so I want to start by thanking, at the time I showed up, my hospitalization and suicide attempt and struggles landed me in a hospital in December 1985. By that time, On Our Own Baltimore was hosting the first Alternatives Conference, and Mike Finkel, I want to thank you for that. Congrats, yeah. I didn't know y'all were up here, right, doing this work. There was a small group of us. My father went to another man in his church. He said, I don't know what to do. My son's in the hospital. He tried to kill himself. He's using drugs. He's out in the street. He doesn't trust us. He thinks we're trying to kill him. He won't eat any of our food. And I don't know what to do. So this man said two words that changed his life, my life too. He said, me too. My son's struggling also. I just took a medical leave from my organization, and we just renovated an old horse barn from across the high school, and we're giving it to the kids to support themselves. Yeah. And we just opened it. So the conversation he had was December, probably that first, December, I went in December 7th. So something like that. And they had just opened it in November. He said, maybe your son will go and meet my son and want to stick around. And my dad said, I don't know, he doesn't. He swings first. He doesn't trust anybody. I don't know how you're going to get through to him. But I'll bring him if he's willing to go. So he had that conversation with me after I got out. There were a few people reaching out to me, trying to engage me, and I was hard to engage. I was not, I looked a lot different too, by the way. I was 100 pounds, maybe soaking wet, had long hair down to my waist, wouldn't let anybody touch my hair. That was kind of like a way, any way people were trying to control me. I was quitting school. I was, just everybody was trying to, get in my head. I heard voices. I trusted only those worlds inside of me and those voices inside of me because they were the ones keeping me safe, not you. So when my dad said, let's go, and I looked through the window of that little door, as we opened the door, I saw the same people that I thought were going to reject me and had been fighting me, skinheads, guys in leather jackets, spikes on their collars, things like that, right? There was a lot of evidence for me, because I would walk in a room and I would say, I don't belong here. That was my mantra. You know, I'm Indian, we have mantras. That was my mantra. And I would find the evidence, you know. You know what happens when you look for the evidence, what happens? You find it. Yeah. So I looked for evidence of the threat of people who were in. I saw them, and I walked in, my guard up as usual, and this one of those skinheads was at the pool table, and he turned over to me and looked at me, and I thought to myself, here we go. And he said, hey, you want to come over and play some pool? And he said it in a way that just, I don't know what it was. It was his eyes or his voice or you know, just took me by surprise. You know what else took me by surprise? My guard dropped. I didn't tell it to, it just dropped. And I walked over to him, and I said, yeah, I do. And my dad's jaw dropped. He couldn't believe I was walking to this other young person, you know? And the kid even made a joke about my hair. He had no hair. I had long hair. And he's like, maybe you'll get a haircut one day, too. And I knew he was just messing around. And for some reason, I wasn't threatened by it. It wasn't fighting words to me for some reason. And I said, yeah, maybe. And I didn't for a long time. It wasn't really, you know, something I wanted to do. But that became my home. Evenings, weekends, before school, after school, holidays, you know, any chance I got, I was there. And we were known as the students who encouraged recovery. You know, it was a place for us to be. And people like me could be there. And I got introduced to advocacy and opportunities I started with that community, developed peer support communities. This was December 1985, January 1985, 86, sorry. And by May 1986, somebody was coming up to me going, can you come and speak to our young people at our locked facility? I said, I don't know. What do you want me to do? Well, they won't talk to anybody, but you've been able to get people to talk to you. We heard about you. Would you be willing to come in and see if they're willing to talk? I said, okay, sure. So I went in, and I didn't have any, we didn't have any trainings back then or, peer specialist academies or anything like that. But what I did have was, by that time, I started to realize that, okay, I could tell a little bit about my story and then ask a couple questions and get them talking. Because if me talking the whole time isn't going to do it, I'm going to get them talking, is what the idea was. So I told them a story about me walking down the street. I thought about it. It came to me as I was walking. I didn't know what story I was going to tell, but when I got in there, I told them a quick story about walking down the street and having to do things that weren't me in order to be the guy that got to be in the center of the two kids that I hung out with, And you had to do things that just weren't, considered normal, And that was what got you here. And so I told that story. And they're like, yeah, that's what it's like in here. That's what it's like out there. That's what it's like with my teachers. That's what it's like, So they started to relate to this conversation about power. And I didn't realize that's what we were having at the time. But it was central to the point. They had this huge conversation. 8 years old to 13-year-old kids, mostly black and brown like me, all struggling with power. And afterwards, the therapist said, wow, that was amazing. Can you come back and do that again? I said, I don't know. I don't think I can. I was like, man, I think I better just quit while I'm ahead, And I said, why? She says, well, I just never heard anybody speak like that. I was like, okay. I said, I don't think I can come, but how about this? On one condition. She said, what is it? I'd like you to leave the room. She said, oh, I can't do that. Why? I said, well, because every time one of us spoke, including myself, I noticed that we looked at you first. And we were deciding whether you could handle what we had to say. So we changed it. Because we knew you couldn't handle what we had to say. So we were speaking in code that whole time. We all knew what we were talking about, but we made sure you didn't. And I'm literally worried. And I realized at that moment that I had to go create things and spaces where we could be, you know it, on our own. Where we could say what was really on our minds in order to heal. We needed to be able to express the trauma, the struggle, the challenges, the fears, the thoughts, the worries, the anger, the outrage, the indignities, and not have somebody come back with us with a lot of excuses or defensiveness or fragility or any of the kind of stuff that would cause them to push a button and then end up in restraints again. So it wasn't a simple thing to pull that off. So that's why I told her, I said, I don't think I can do it if I can't come back. And she said, we can't do it. Sorry, you weren't even supposed to be here. This is against the rules already. I said, all right, well, we'll work on that. So I started doing these peer support meetings on our own in group homes and adolescent residences. I got offered a closet at the psychiatric center. A tech would sneak me in to the adolescent unit in there. With, kind of in the back door kind of thing. And we got it started. Now, I share all that because, you fast forward to today, we've got all of that all around. And when we think about the history of On Our Own Maryland, you were the first, not only the first conference in 1985, nationally, the first alternatives, but, you were the first drop-in center, funded in, was it 83, 84, something like that. All right. You were the first statewide advocacy organization of its kind. All right. Mental health clients in California started after that. We had a New York Liberation Project after that. There was, leaders like Sally Zimman who were, in California. I remember her telling me once, she was like, it turned the tide. What On Our Own did, turned the tide. Next thing you know, all across the country, they were saying consumer-run services need to be a part of the system everywhere, part of the continuum, everywhere. Yeah. That was amazing to hear and to see how much had happened there. So it's a celebration, man. I mean, I want you to know, you're part of a history here that is critical. So I'm going to tell you something, though. There's a quote that I like to offer. A.T. Ariadne. He's a Sri Lankan activist. And he would say things like, look, when you're trying to bring about change in society, a few things are going to happen. You're going to get ridiculed, you're going to dismissed, you're going to pushed aside, Eventually, they'll try to oppress you, and they do. But then comes the most dangerous stage, when they give you respect. So I wonder why that is. Is it? I'm curious what you all think. I'd love to hear about it. Tell me later, all right? So for me, though, it's because we're always at risk of recreating the same qualities, and I say qualities in quotes, all right, that outraged us in the first place. We are just as likely as anyone else. Doesn't matter what our histories or identities have been or how far as we've gone, right? We could become the oppressor. So how do we pay attention to that? How do we avoid that? How do we make sure that we're handling that moment where we get invited to the front of the room, to the mic, to the table, right? Given the funding. This was the argument of the movement as well. We were concerned about taking the money. We were concerned about whether we could pull it up. All of our peer support meetings, all those that I did, all volunteer, all funded at all. None at all. We had a soda machine that paid for some of it, all right? But that was about it. Then the money started rolling. And somebody came to me and said, hey, man, we're not clients. I said, what are you talking about? They're calling us clients now, and they think that's an improvement. I said, oh, okay, let's figure that out. So we started to have these conversations about who we were. And at the same time, I was looking around and saying, who are the people in the front of the room? How come none of us, when I said us, I was talking about most of us who were black and brown, kind of going, I don't see any of us in leadership. I was looking for us all the time. And it was a frustration of mine. And then there was this man named Lionel Aldridge. He was a Green Bay Packer, NFL football player. Anybody heard of him? Yeah? All right. Now, Mr. Aldridge had been the first NFL football player to come out having been diagnosed with schizophrenia. So like me, he had a psychotic disorder history of, that I could relate to. I was like, oh, okay, this, and he was talking in Rochester. He was doing the circuit of speaking. He had been coming out and doing this. And so I went to go see him speak. And this is when I was about 19 years old. I'd already been in the movement for a while. I'd been organizing. I had brought people to Albany. We'd been doing state advocacy. We were advocating at closing state psychiatric centers and reinvesting funding. I'd been advocating against forced treatment. I'd been working with the Mental Patients Liberation Alliance in our central New York area. We had a lot of stuff happening. George Ebert was one of the people there at the time. And I think, when I saw Mr. Aldridge speak, he talked about everything in his mental health experience I could relate to and I identified, and I saw him speak with a freedom that I really just wanted for myself. And I was the first in line after he spoke, right, to talk to him and ask him a question. And I had a million questions, like, why didn't he bring up racism? There's a lot of different things that I wondered about, Because I've heard him talk about racism since, and at that time he would have different articles. It was always a different conversation. There was the mental health conversation over here, and I'm not picking on Mr. Aldridge, by the way. Everyone was doing it. All right? Nobody saw what I felt was my experience, which was, the experiences that I had as a young person coming to this country. We immigrated to this country, and people just immediately said, go back to where you came from. You don't belong here. All the different, and at the time there was huge racial tension in Rochester, where we moved up from New York City. We went from Washington Heights up to Rochester to get jobs. Kodak wasn't even hiring people of color. They had just kind of had the civil rights riots happen, and there was a fight coalition fighting with Kodak at the time up there, and they finally just decided to give people of color jobs, and there was a huge amount of resentment because people were taking their jobs, moving into their neighborhoods, is what they would say, right? And so I would get it as a 5-year-old, as a 6-year-old, right? It didn't matter where I went. So I was wondering, why aren't they having this conversation? That is a social determinant. I didn't use that language back then, but I knew it was a determinant of my health. I knew that it was a part of my experience by the time I was walking up to Mr. Aldridge. So I asked him, I gave him a softball, an easier question, but it was still a question on my mind, which was, they keep talking about this thing, that this diagnosis of mine being a cyclical illness. Like, I'm going to keep going through this over and over and over again. Is that true? Because that's what I wanted, because the justification for keeping me in my program, because I'd been in a program, they didn't even want me to go back to school. I'd been out of school for 2 years, that kind of thing, and they wanted to keep me in services and keep me under their watch, And there were, I had a therapist that was telling me maybe it's better not to worry about having children or having a family or being in relationships, because of my history. So I asked him, I said, is this always the way it's going to be? I get a little better and then I get worse? Is that the story? And he said, he just kind of said, look, and he said it for everybody to hear at the table. He said, that's not how it is, man. People don't grow like that. We grow out, up, down, around, And what I started to picture was these spirals, these cycles. They were cycles, but they were cycles of growth. He was like, every time you go through something, if you notice, it's different on the inside. It looks the same to people on the outside because they're confused by some of what they're seeing. So they come up with their own story about it. That's why we're here. Because we need to tell our story about it. Right? Okay, thank you, yeah. So I was so grateful because he freed me up. That moment was important. That was a moment where I said, okay, so what I'm seeing about my experience. So then I went to another, book and another book, and I started to read the literature of the movement in a different way. My liberation was what I was seeking. My liberation from the story that they were telling about me, My liberation from the things that were actually, holding me back. And I realized that as I started to get better, things weren't changing for some of my friends. Just because I was starting to get free, I noticed, and a lot of times it was because of the privilege that I had. I had a family that had my back in a way that I couldn't believe. They refused certain things. They didn't let the system take me over. There's a lot of different things that I'm very fortunate to have, and I noticed that a lot of my friends didn't, and so I couldn't just leave. I couldn't just find a better life and come back. I didn't know how that was possible for me anyway. So I said, we need to do this more, and we kind of started to organize locally around things that mattered to us, right? And we started to do it in a way that brought issues that I would say that, I guess we used a lens like forced treatment. Let's use that example because it is affecting all of you here in Maryland as well. What we saw in New York was that there was a disproportionate number of people of color that ended up in forced treatment. And that became true everywhere else we looked, right? In California too, and in New York. So that's a racial inequity. When we talk about deepening the conversation about racism, we're talking about having people look at that information from a racial equity lens, and really understand it. All right, how we doing? Okay so far? Okay, good. So I got a little bit more to share with you. Now maybe time to look at my glasses here. There were a few messages that Judy Chamberlain, that our namesake of her book On Our Own has for Maryland, for On Our Own Maryland. There was a few things that were really important about the On Our Own meant, yes, just like I said to that therapist, can you leave the room so we could do this ourselves. There was a real important message about being on our own, the exclusion of non-patients, as she would have put, as Judy put it back then. And Judy and I worked together. We were kind of worked together as part of the founding of the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry back in 2000. That was a founders meeting in Vancouver where I got to be around the table with people like Leonard Frank and Judy and David Oakes and people from other countries like Carl Bach and Mary O'Hagan from New Zealand. And we had these conversations, but the conversation I had with them was, you need to be able to make room for stories that aren't just like yours. Stories like mine, they're not going to fit, and you're going to keep having the same people be your leadership, And that case got, made there, and Judy understood that too. But one of the things that I bring up here is that the idea that she said one of the critical messages of our movement and priorities of our movement was raising consciousness. Raising consciousness about what? About what Lionel Aldridge was saying to me, to help me rethink what I've been told about myself. Raising consciousness about our experience. And what I was doing in that room with them, along with other people, was raising consciousness about other aspects of our experience, including aspects of marginalization and oppression related to race and racism. All right? Those aren't separate conversations anymore. They can no longer be race-neutral policies, And part of the issue is that, well, isn't race a sociological fiction, Chacku? I was like, yes, it is. Race is. But racism is also, race is a biological fiction, right? Built on and created to oppress, right? I'll say it again. Thank you, Denise. All right? That is the fact. It is a biological fiction. However, racism is a sociological reality. All right? And it is constructed by that narrative, that master narrative, as Pat Deegan would put it, you know? And if we didn't acknowledge that and talk about our experiences from that perspective and from that lens, we would continue to recreate, again, the same qualities and policies that ensnared us and outraged us in the first place. All right, so that is what we mean by racist action. It is the actions that create racial inequities, okay? Or inequities of differences of any kind. And the difference between a disparity and inequity is simply that the inequity is unjust. It doesn't have to be that way. All right? And so that's the lens that we're starting to look at our policies at. And there's a number of them, whether it's the inequities in force and coercion models like mental health and drug courts. You got to look at those. All right? You got to look at the graduation rates of programs. You got to look at who's staying in programs longer. You got to look at our unemployment rate. We have had an unemployment rate of in our community of 60 to 80 to 90% unemployment. Why are we not in the streets about that? Well, I'll tell you why. Because we're also in the streets about being killed by cops every day. It's hard to pick what you're going to be out in the street about when there's all of this inequity. So that's the conversation. So I'm at a conference like this in New York called NIAPRS in the 90s, and a woman named Pamina Yellowbird was speaking there. She was there to speak about the Hiawatha Indians who were sent to asylum, you know, and the erasure of her people, you know. And one of the things that happened, and I was outside at that conference. I was outside smoking a cigarette, pacing back and forth, outraged at the master narrative, just not feeling like I belonged, not feeling like anybody was getting what, you know, I was about or what we were about. And so she saw me, and she was about to go in and keynote, but she was also outside, and she said, "Hey, are you okay?" You know, just kind of checking in with me. And I said, "No, I'm not." And I just kind of went off on a rant, you know. And she listened to me for a few minutes talking about it. And she says, "Oh, I get it." So, because I was telling her how when I walk into a room, people just start talking like as if I'm not supposed to be there, you know. Like, what's he doing here? Whether it's because I'm a person of color or because I'm a kid or whatever it was, you know. And she said, "Okay, I get it. You're feeling marginalized by your experience of being different." I said, "Yeah, exactly." And she said, "Okay. Well, you know, did it ever occur to you that your difference is actually your power?" Wow. So what are you talking? And I got mad on the inside. I just finished telling her about how I'm feeling marginalized by my difference, and she's telling me, who the heck is she to tell me that my marginalization is actually my power? My difference is my power. All right, and she's like, "Look, I got to go do my keynote, so I got to go." She didn't have time to talk about it. So she ran off. And as she was going off, I was like, actually, she does get to tell me that because her people have been erased. She might know something about that, you know? So I thought about it some more. And I realized that what was I doing with that moment that everybody stopped talking? Because that's what she asked me as she walked out the door. What are you doing with that moment? It may not be for the reasons you wanted it to be, right? You wanted them to turn to you and go, "Hey, Chacku, tell me something." You know? And instead they were literally saying, "What are you doing here? What am I going to do with that moment? What difference can I make with that moment?" I had the privilege, and that's what the word she used. You have the privilege of being here. What are we going to do while we are here? I didn't get to be at a lot of alternatives conferences. I didn't get to be at a lot of conferences. I didn't understand. I was like, "What do any of these people work?" Like, you know what I mean? They got jobs, right? It's hard to get to these things. So when I was here with you, I wanted to get stuff done, you know? And we were constantly organizing, constantly trying to understand what we could do better, how we could do it better, you know? And to make sure our story was in the room, to make sure I could hear another person's story. Because let me tell you, I was changed by every story I've ever heard. I'm a different man on the other side of every story I hear. You know? So I encourage you to do the same. Take advantage of that. And I didn't understand the intersectionality that I had in my own life was also going on with everybody else in that particular conference and everybody else in our movement. And what I mean by intersectionality is very simple, is that we have multiple identities. I'm not just an Indian, right? I'm an Indian man. I'm also not just an Indian man. I'm also an Indian man with a psychiatric history and diagnosis and disability and substance use history. And I've been in handcuffs. I've been in restraints. You know, I have a lot of different marginalized experiences and identities, right? And somehow at a conference like this, they get clapped for, you know? All right? So thank you. Now, that's the twist, isn't it? That the very same experiences of marginalization can be experienced as an experience of power and privilege when I'm with all of you, because you value it. All right? That's the somewhat relativity of it. But then there's also this recognition that, oh yeah, there is a great deal of privilege that comes with just being born a man. And then being perceived as one. All right? I don't get questioned about a few things, whether it's in my family or in the society, or I can go to a women's rights rally and they'll come to me for a quote. You know? So how do we start to recognize the roles that each of these areas of our identities, the various power and privileges that we have, the various marginalizations and oppressions that we have, the compounding and cumulative effect of them as an identity, all right, individually as a person, is also the same complexity. It's a very complex process, but it's the same complexity we have as a movement. Okay? So as a movement, we are also going through that very same identity development process. It's like a teenager. We're still teenagers right now. You know? And what I mean that in the very best way, because we have the opportunity to actually reflect on our differences and say, how can we use that? How can that be a powerful source for us, right? How can we make this change? And I think one of the things that has struggled, you know, there's this thing called the zero-sum game. A woman named Heather McGhee wrote a book called The Sum of Us. I encourage you to check it out. And one of the things that sparked that book was the study that these guys at Harvard did. Is they were studying, why is it that more white people are kind of feeling like less than, and using words like reverse racism, now that anti-black racism is kind of reducing a little bit. So in other words, as things got kind of perceived to be somewhat better, just from an attitude perspective, forgive me, I'm not saying like completely better, but when things from the 50s to 2000 started, anti-black sentiment started to kind of reduce, let's say, anti-black sentiment started to reduce, they started to feel like, and they studied this, and it was clear that in the study that anti-white perceptions of anti-white bias was increasing. Now, that was just according to white people, though. I'm serious. So they asked people of color the same thing, and they said, "Oh no, it's not any worse for them." All right? But there was a clear confusion about that. All right? And the reason I bring this up is because that zero-sum game is this idea that and it kept operationalizing the policies, is that if black and brown got better in this country, white people would get worse. That was what the narrative was. All right? That you couldn't even have the same access to a swimming pool before they would drain it all. And they did that. All right? That's right. That's right. Thank you, Denise. So these aspects of the zero-sum game, when I say deepening, what I'm trying to get at is that, is it a zero-sum game, or can all boats rise in the water? The belief system, all right? So when someone said to me, Sherry Mead said to me one time when she was like, you know, man, I want to ask you, how are you feeling right now? I said, I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I'm outraged, I'm upset, I'm sad, I'm lonely. So how do you want to feel? I said, I want to feel loved, I want to feel belonging, I want to feel connected, I want to feel included, I want to feel welcome, I want to feel like my parents love me and want me around. What would you have to believe in order to feel that way? I'd have to believe my parents love me and want me around. I have to believe that people are looking for me, to care for me. I'd have to believe that I have something to offer, that I have a contribution. I have to believe that my thoughts, feelings, my perceptions matter to you. So maybe we can also choose the belief that our liberation, your liberation is bound up with mine, What is our liberation? Lilo Watson was saying that as the Aboriginal leader in the apartheid movement in the 60s and 70s in Australia. They asked her, what can we do to help change colonialism in this way? She said, look, if you've come to help me, you've wasted your time. But if your liberation is bound up with mine, then we can work together, right? And that's what this is about. Gilberto Romero, my mentor out of New Mexico, he would say it all the time. He's still my mentor, by the way. He's a close friend. He said, Chacku, everyone's in, no one's out. Everyone's in, no one's out. That has to be our public health message. So that, and at the same, yes, thank you. We need to convince everybody. He did a radio show for decades. We need to convince everybody that we're here and see us. So I call on you to do that. Thank you for welcoming me and seeing me and hearing me and welcoming me. Please, there's so much more to do. Go out there. I know I should probably stop, all right? So thanks again for your time.